I'm going to talk about these three topics: Russia, sexuality, and violence, and I think they're all very exciting. So if you combine them all together, the whole thing becomes even more exciting, like 3 times more exciting than before. And the research started with the introduction of the gay propaganda law in 2013 in Russia, which is here on the screen with its text that makes very little sense, right? It's the ban of propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations, which according to the Supreme Court of Russia is male homosexuality, lesbian, bisexual, and trans experiences, so LGBT identities. And the law basically says that you cannot disseminate information about LGBT sexualities because once people access that information or are exposed to an LGBT rally, they actually become gay, right? And many politicians, especially high-ranking politicians, said that it's not a big deal, this law. People, LGBT people, can still feel comfort and peace in Russia. So I decided to check whether or not it is true. Yeah, and I wanted to specifically focus on one possible effect of the gay propaganda law, whether or not it increases the level of violence against LGBT people in Russia. Luckily enough, all court decisions in Russia are stored in a state-maintained system that is accessible to public online. There is also an alternative database of court decisions, and I decided to find out information about violence against LGBT people there in those databases. I used 2 of them just to make sure that the results are accurate. So, searching there in those databases with the keywords, I came up with almost 3,000 court decisions that somehow relate to LGBT topics, but not all of them were about violence, right? So after a thorough analysis, the decisions number was reduced to 297 cases of violence against LGBT people in Russia in 2011-2016. In order to come up with that number, which is a unique number of cases, I used my very simple definition of what a hate crime is. It combines 3 elements. It has to be a violation of criminal law, and sexuality and prejudice of the perpetrator, so sexuality of the victim and prejudice of the perpetrator, have to feature somehow in the text of the decisions. So I also subdivided all those cases of violence against LGBT people in Russia into 3 groups. Homicide includes all crimes or incidents of violence that resulted in the victim's death, including manslaughter, for example. Violence includes all sorts of violence that did not result in death, like torture, different sorts of harm to health or bodily harm to the victim, kidnappings, and so on and so forth. And finally, larceny are all those crimes targeted at LGBT people that involve taking away their properties, like robbery, theft, extortion, right? So hate crimes that I'm looking at are not insults on the streets. They are violent offenses against people. Eventually, after years of research, I came up with this graph. It's the number of victims, of LGBT victims of these hate crimes according to my definition. And as you see, from 2011 to 2016, and as you see in 2013, this number significantly grows, and it actually doubles by 2015. I'm not saying that the gay propaganda law is solely responsible for this growth of violence in Russia, but the coincidence that the incidence of violence grows exactly in 2013 is at least suspicious. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alexander. That is very compelling stuff.
Thank you.
I'd like to start off with Russian law and hate crimes. Does Russian law actually recognize hate crimes as a category, and how does it view them if it does?
Well, as a matter of fact, it does recognize hate crime as a category. So Russian law in this regard is very well developed, and it has many different ways or forms of recognition of hate crimes. Like, for example, the definition of hate crime is included into many criminal law articles, and judges can apply that definition so that they could increase the sentence, give more years to a perpetrator of a hate crime violence in comparison to normal violence. And the only thing is that sexual orientation, so hate towards people that are different by their sexual orientation, is not included in the law. There is a notion of social group, and basically the Supreme Court actually says that you have to interpret the idea, the notion of social group as inclusive for LGBT identities. But the judges on the cases that I reviewed do it very rarely. In fact, there were only 4 cases when actual hate crime law was enforced or applied in the decisions.
So do you think that this is somehow ideological, that actual judges in courts in small towns across Russia have something against gay people, and that's the reason why they don't apply hate crime laws or harshen the sentences? Or why is it?
Yeah, well, judges in Russia or elsewhere, they do have their own prejudices. There's a classical research in sociology of law that says that a ruling, a decision of a judge depends on what the judge had for breakfast, right? So, yeah, of course they have their prejudices, but at the same time, I think that the major reason, at least in Russia, is that the very process of applying hate crime legislation is very complicated. And what the judges do, they do their everyday mundane job, and they just need to, you know, kind of complete the case to get it done as soon as possible. So I think they more or less resist to a very complicated and procedurally complicated, let's say, ideology of hate crime, as well as to political implications of state-sponsored homophobia. They are somewhere in between, doing their everyday job and just minding their business in the easiest way possible.
That's a good point. So they're not necessarily applying hate crime law, but they're not applying the gay propaganda law either.
Yeah. Well, if they, you know, if the case actually deals with gay propaganda, then they definitely apply gay propaganda law, but not in these violence cases.
Super interesting. You have actually told me that this is only the first stage of your work. Where are you going on to next with your findings?
Oh, let me tell you all about it. It's actually a huge project. And so to come up with that graph, I had to actually read all those cases. So it's a sort of quantitative result of a very qualitative work. I've been just reading and reading the cases of violence, and I thought that it's not a particularly interesting reading, but it gives a lot of ideas and a lot of information that is simply not accessible if you don't get to read the court decision. So I think it's going to be a book project. I already have a title. It's called Violent Affections. I think it's a very sexy title. And It's going to consist of at least 4 or 5 chapters. So I'm going to talk about sexuality and how judges understand sexuality. Then I'm going to talk about hate, emotions, and how emotions circulate in the society. I'm going to talk about law. And finally, I'm going to talk about the crime scenes, the locations that kind of combine this all together. Sexuality, emotions, and law into a macabre mixture of I don't know what yet.
Can't wait to actually see what you come up with. Sounds very interesting. Thank you so much. Everyone, let's give another round of applause to Alexander Kondakov.
Thank you.